Drew's return from the edge was not a miracle, it was an intervention. When the gunfire ended and the assailant slipped away under cover of panic and sirens, a calculus had already begun. Bullets are blunt instruments, they leave splinters, witnesses, evidence chains. Poison, in contrast, is a whisper. If the first attempt on Drew's life was a message, the second, if it comes, will be about silence. That is the logical pivot raised by his survival. The hunt doesn't end when a victim lives, it evolves. And in Port Charles, evolution often favors predators who learn quickly. Tracy Quartermain did not save Drew by accident. Say what you will about her sharper edges and corporate instincts, she recognized a fractional window between injury and irretrievable collapse and used it. The ambulance she summoned did more than stabilize a body, it disrupted a plan. Whatever narrative the shooter hoped to cement, a tidy line from gunshots to funeral, fractured the moment a pulse held under fluorescent lights. Survival is always a complication for an attacker because it introduces two dangerous variables, memory and investigation. The first produces testimony, the second produces constraints. Both are anathema to anyone who relies on speed and misdirection. The PCPD's response reflects that tension. An open gun case disperses officers, mobilizes ballistics, and quickly reaches for familiar levers, timeline reconstruction, shell casing correlation, and the drudgery of canvassing camera feeds. The killer can anticipate those steps because they are predictable. That is precisely why a second attempt would be unlikely to echo the first. In practical terms, pulling another trigger at the same target after a citywide alert multiplies risk by orders of magnitude. In dramatic terms, repeating the method drains tension, it stops being a chess match and becomes a grind. Port Charles thrives on the pivot, the unexpected feint that forces both characters and viewers to reassess. Poison is the perfect pivot. Poison collapses the distance between safety and danger. You can lock doors against a gun, you cannot lock a bloodstream. A toxin merges with routines, meals, medications, hydration, and turns ordinary care into a vector. It produces delays that confuse causality, symptoms appear hours later, in a different room, in front of different witnesses. The villain's risk profile improves because the scene of the crime disperses across time, diluting the value of surveillance footage and neighborhood canvases. For the police, it complicates intent, for the hospital, it turns every admission into a potential forensic minefield. For Drew, that means the perimeter around his body must be conceptual, not just physical. He can surround himself with security and still lose a step with a single contaminated cup. He can empty a room and still be undone by a mislabeled vial. The more he relies on routines to feel normal, morning coffee, post-PT smoothies, evening meetings, the more those routines can be exploited. Survival triggers benevolent interference, friends deliver meals, colleagues stop by with drinks, nurses switch shifts. Each kindness adds a variable. Poison thrives in variables. This is where Kai Taylor enters the frame, not as villain or hero, but as a logistical link. If the first attack established Drew as a high-profile patient-boss hybrid, Kai inhabits the vulnerable in-between, a gatekeeper whose role blends personal loyalty with practical access. He may be the one who notices the slump before anyone else, the one whose call to 911 arrives with too much emotion to sound rehearsed and too much knowledge to seem naive. That makes him the ideal accidental suspect in a second crisis, especially now that his fingerprints are already stitched to the earlier crime scene through that bat, a detail that functions less as proof and more as leverage. In a city like Port Charles, leverage is often enough to rearrange the board. If Drew suddenly collapses, at home, at the office, at the hospital, Kai's proximity, his caregiving, and his previous connection to evidence will counter the first wave of suspicion. Prosecutors and detectives are not blind to the drama patterns, nor are they immune to them. Caretaker poisoner is an archetype because it gives the investigation a narrative spine, a way to explain access without conspiracy. That does not make it true. It makes it convenient. And early convenience, in thrillers and police work alike, is frequently the red herring that lets the real criminal move again while everyone admires the tidy fit of a premature theory. From the killer's perspective, pivoting to poison offers a triple dividend. First, it reframes motive. What looked like a rash act of violent elimination becomes an insidious, patient correction of an earlier mistake. Second, it changes the battlefield from public terrain, doorways, driveways, alleys, into private space, kitchens, wards, medication carts, where institutional protocols can be mimicked or subverted. Third, it revives the psychological campaign. A gun wound shouts, poison makes Drew doubt his environment and, worse, his judgment. Does he trust the coffee Kai brought? The vitamins Tracy insisted on? The hospital drip adjusted by a nurse with a calm smile and a laminated badge? When a target starts asking those questions, the attack continues even when the toxin is absent. Fear is the residue of a good plan. This shift mirrors past patterns in Port Charles, escalations that trade spectacle for subtlety. Consider Sonny Corinthos' brushes with orchestrated death, an explosion that screams headline followed by a clinical assault with a syringe. Different methods, same message, nowhere is safe. Those arcs teach an important lesson about serialized storytelling and in-universe criminal strategy alike. Variety sustains momentum and destabilizes defenses. If the show's craft and the villain's cunning align, Drew's path will bend through the same curve, from blunt force to invisible edge. What, then, would a rational defense look like? It starts with admitting that security is not a perimeter problem but a supply chain problem. Every item that touches Drew's body should be traceable, food sealed and logged, medications checked by dual custody with barcode confirmation, beverages moved in tamper-evident containers. This is unglamorous television, but it's the kind of unglamorous detail that turns a second attempt into an evidentiary trap. If poison is introduced despite these measures, the audit trail shrinks the suspect pool in hours, not days. Next comes the human layer. Drew must build a circle that is both small and overlapping. Small keeps the list of handlers tight, overlapping prevents any single person from exerting unchecked control. Tracy's presence helps because she delights in oversight and does not mind being resented for it. That quality, often grating in boardrooms, becomes priceless at a bedside. Pair her with a clinical team that welcomes redundancy rather than bristles at it. Require that no item reaches Drew without two independent verifications, and then require that both verifiers log it in separate systems. Overkill? Only until the first symptom hits. And those symptoms are the story's fuse. Poisons that mimic dehydration or flu would grant a patient hours of plausible deniability, fatigue, mild confusion, nausea, before a crisis reveals itself. That lag benefits a killer by scattering the breadcrumbs. It also benefits the writers. It allows for escalating dread, for misinterpreted signs, for the awful beat where someone blames stress and suggests rest just before the collapse. If Kai is the first to see it, he will be the first to suffer the narrative penalty, the suspicion that follows a frantic call. If Tracy is the first to see it, the penalty will be different, accusations of overreach, of weaponizing concern, of projecting corporate control onto clinical care. Either path pushes characters into conflict while keeping the central thread alive. The PCPD, meanwhile, must resist its own habits. Gun crimes seduce with ballistic certainties, tox cases lure with the illusion that a lab report will name a killer. In reality, poison produces a maze of maybes, lab values that suggest but do not prove, residue that narrows but does not name. Good investigators will look for those other signatures, procurement records for restricted agents, unusual purchases by hospital staff, digital footprints that reveal searches about dosage and onset time. Great investigators will also map opportunity against personality. Who benefits from a slow end rather than a public one? Who is clever enough to adapt methods after the first attempt failed? Who grew quiet after the shooting, not out of fear but because they were busy planning for a subtler try? Motives are plentiful in a town like this. Financial leverage. Corporate succession. Legal exposure. Old vengeance wearing new clothes. The list is long, which is why method matters. Choice of poison can signal intent. A toxin that imitates cardiac failure suggests a killer comfortable with hospital chaos. An industrial agent points to access beyond medicine. Something plant-based and obscure hints at an academic or hobbyist's pride. Viewers might not get the full toxicology monologue on screen, but the arc can still leverage the logic. The villain is not simply a person, the villain is a pattern. Drew's demeanor will shape outcomes as much as any lab value. If survival becomes bravado, I've already beaten death once this week, he will make the next attempt easier. If survival becomes paralysis, no one touches anything, no one comes in, he will alienate allies and push care underground. The middle path is uncomfortable but necessary, vigilance without paranoia, audit without accusation. It is, ironically, the arc of a leader. He has to make the people around him better at caring for him by making them better at suspecting each other, then help them forgive themselves for the suspicion later. That's a complex ask, but complexity is the currency of this universe. Kai's arc is the most precarious. The story will be tempted, rightly, to flirt with his culpability. A planted bottle in his bag. A misremembered instruction that became a medication error. A security camera clip where he steps into a room 30 seconds before the monitors spike. These are weapons of implication, not proof, and they can drive a devastating middle act where loyalty buckles under evidence that almost fits. If the writers are humane, they will give Kai something that refuses to fit, a refusal to leave the phone line during the emergency call, a witness who saw him dump the coffee he had poured because he noticed a cracked seal, a small, unshowy act of resistance that prevents the audience from abandoning him even as the plot tries to. There is, finally, the meta-truth that shapes all of this. Audiences crave unpredictability, but they reward coherence. A second blunt attack on Drew would feel redundant and credulity straining. A pivot to poison, on the other hand, preserves danger while honoring consequence, of the first investigation, of hospital protocol, of Tracy's relentless attention. It also opens parallel corridors for antagonists and allies alike. Tracy gets to weaponize procedure. The PCPD gets to flex beyond their ballistic comfort zone. Kai gets to stand in the crucible where loyalty and suspicion share a border. And the unseen killer? They get to reveal themselves by how they change, not just by what they did first. The smartest version of this plot will borrow a technique from Sunny's survival saga, escalation by diversification. A town learns to guard against one threat, then a different one arrives through a different door. Port Charles is famous for distrust. This arc can refine it into a survival skill. With every cup sealed, every vial scanned, every bag logged, the killer's path narrows until ingenuity gives way to exposure. The payoff is not just catching a culprit. It's watching a community convert fear into systems, paranoia into practice, and drama into the kind of earned catharsis that makes the next episode feel inevitable and surprising at once. So yes, Drew should be careful in the aftermath, not because the story demands timidity, but because caution is now character development. He lives because someone refused to accept a script written in gunfire. He stays alive if he and the people around him refuse to accept that survival ends the story. If a second attack comes, it will likely be quiet, clinical, and devastatingly intimate. But quiet danger has a weakness: it hates attention. Shine enough light on the chain of custody, on the gaps between kindness and access, and the poisoner's advantage evaporates. In Port Charles, the killers always adapt. The heroes must, too.